Shivshankar Menon, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Ambassador, why is it that Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping did not have a one-on-one meeting at this recent summit? And this would have been a very rare in-person chance for them to connect again after 2.5 years of COVID.
I'm really not sure. I wonder what happened, because I think the general expectation was that they'd use the chance, because relations have been rocky since, the clashes on the border in 2020. And the political relationship has actually been quite frigid, even though trade is going on. I mean, in fact, set records last year, and China is back to being India's #1 trading partner. Frankly, I don't know the reason, and we'll have to wait to hear from both sides about what actually happened.
Well, media speculation, of course, is that neither side is ready to forgive and forget, particularly after what happened in Sri Lanka.
I'm not sure. I'd be very careful about speculating about what actually happened, and I'd rather wait to hear authoritatively what happened, because frankly, forgive and forget is not the right term for these. Politics is an evolutionary process. It's not so much a question of forgiving and forgetting as moving forward and moving on and deciding where to go from here.
Okay, let's though have a quick look at what happened in Sri Lanka. And that, you cannot deny, was pretty fractious. Why did the Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka choose to make this very public criticism of New Delhi?
One is, it's part of a much more assertive Chinese diplomacy that we've seen for several years, what people call wolf warrior diplomacy, but it's not really that. But it has been more assertive, a much more in-your-face defense of China's interests and points of view. But also, I think maybe there's a particular sensitivity in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has been talking to China now. It defaulted on her debt in April, has been talking to China now for over 10 months about rescheduling the debt. About 20% of China's debt, of Sri Lanka's foreign debt is to China. So China is a big part of any possible solution. So far, at least, China has only been willing to reschedule, to refinance the debt, which means to add more debt to what Sri Lanka already has. And that clearly is not a viable or sustainable solution. So there is a fair amount of criticism in Sri Lanka and elsewhere saying, China needs to participate in solving this problem.
Let me pick up on that wolf warrior comment. Is the Chinese Communist Party moving towards a more bellicose wolf warrior type rhetoric?
I think it's part of a general pattern of diplomacy. I think most extreme in the Chinese case recently, because it contrasts so much with what Chinese diplomats used to do in the past. But it's not only Chinese diplomats. And I think one big reason why people seem much more assertive or much more aggressive in their projection of their points of view is because of social media and the whole competitive climate in which they now operate. Diplomacy, foreign policy used to be something that establishments or elites did in private among themselves. I mean, traditionally, classically. But over time, I think it's been democratized. And now, actually, everybody participates in it. It matters whether you can actually get other people's public opinion to see your point of view, whether you can persuade people to your persuasion. So, and I think that's really led to some of what is now called wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think Chinese diplomats, partly because they are measured, the audience that they seem to be addressing in many of these cases doesn't seem to be abroad. It probably is at home, where it probably wins them points at home to be seen to be very strong defenders of China's interests. And this is something which increasingly you'll notice in the foreign policies of great powers, that the domestic politics and the way it looks at home seems to drive many more of them seems to have much more influence on the shaping of foreign policy decisions than it used to in the past.
I mean, if you compare with when you were ambassador to China, do you feel that there is much less of this sort of quiet discussion behind the scenes and trying to solve things without having to have it all out in the open, and quite frankly, moving towards name calling?
Well, I would hope that the quiet stuff still goes on, because ultimately that's where business is going to be done. And that's why I think it's important that the quiet conversations, and to get a sense of where your interlocutor's interests are, his red lines, his core interests, and to see how you can manage difficult situations. I think that has to be done quietly, even now. And I do hope that that goes on, that is continuing. But, there's less and less evidence of it. If you look at the relations between the great powers, they're really stressed. I mean, it's not just China and India, it's China and the US, it's Japan and China. You look at Russia's relations with the West. I mean, it's wherever you look, there are increasingly, it's getting harder and harder for us to believe that, oh no, economic integration, globalization, and trade and so on is going to soften the rough edges of strategic competition.
Do you think, therefore, it makes this a more dangerous world?
It is certainly a much more dangerous world because politics seems to be in command, not economics. And in many cases, that politics is defined in zero-sum terms as winning and losing rather than as, let's see how we can improve our common situation. Trade, by definition, helps everyone. I mean, all boats rise with the rising tide. But that's not true in geopolitical competition and strategic competition. And unfortunately, these two impulses are pulling us in opposite directions, and politics seems to count for more and more.
Let's take another thing that's happening, which is going to happen in October, and that is the military drills between India and the US up in the high mountains, right next to the border with China. But isn't this a very sensitive and strange time to be holding military drills when the Communist Chinese Party is holding its national congress?
Well, I think the exercises were announced long before the dates of the Congress were known. And frankly, October is a good month when the weather in India, at least, is good. I mean, it's not as though this was calculated because the Congress is going on at the same time. And there are only so many days in the calendar. So things will happen coincidentally at the same time. They will be simultaneous. But I wouldn't link these two. Fact is that India and the US have a defense relationship, which has got much closer over the last few years. And we've been exercising now this same exercise. We've been doing this for years. I mean, if China chooses to take offense, that's a different thing. That tells you something about the nature of the political relationship. I don't think it tells you anything about the nature of the exercises or what they mean or what they're meant to mean.
Do you think, though, that we are facing a much greater likelihood of conflict and of soldiers being killed?
It's certainly much more tense than it was before. And since 2020, and there has been a buildup on both sides. Whether that buildup has restored deterrence, I'm not sure. Yes, there is a much higher risk of accidental or other conflict, of various kinds of conflict. But what gives me heart is the fact that since the summer of 2020, both governments have signaled an interest in playing it down and keeping it calm. But neither side has stepped back. Both sides have different views of how to solve the problem. They're talking to each other, and I hope they manage to settle this among themselves.
But do you think things could get better between India and China relations?
Look, these are two countries with 4,000 years of statecraft. Surely they can handle this.
Is that a prediction or an optimism?
It's optimism. It's not a prediction. I dare not predict where they're going. But I would hope that they can do this. I have enough faith in both countries.
What about those who say that India used to be really non-aligned, but now that's changed as well quite a bit. Now India doesn't have anything against being seen as being reasonably cozy with Washington, D.C.
You know, it's interesting. I'm old enough to remember a time when we were accused of not being non-aligned because we were too close to the Soviet Union. And we said, no, we're non-aligned. Today, it's the other way around. We're accused of being too close to the US. And as far as we are concerned, I think what we follow, I think the present leadership would call a policy of strategic autonomy. And that's the sort of phrase that we've used since roughly the turn of this century. So, and there's a difference there. Non-alignment, yes, would preclude certain kinds of closeness with a superpower or with other great powers. But strategic autonomy only means that you have the right to make your own decisions on issues. And one of those decisions could be to be very close to one particular power or another at a particular time. If it suits your interests, that's what you would do. So I would say that India remains strategically autonomous in very fundamental ways. Look at the reaction to the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And India has abstained on the resolutions on the sanctions and so on, but has respected them in practice. At the same time, Prime Minister Modi in Samarkand a few days ago at the SCO summit told Putin that this is not an era for war. And so I think there is an autonomous Indian position and view which is founded on our interests. And that will continue. I've heard Chinese scholars for the last 3 or 4 years say, oh, India is no longer non-aligned, as though sort of India's gone over to the dark side, as it were. Maybe, that's the way they see it. But frankly, there was a time when China was doing much more with the US than India is doing today. And even now, China's trade and so on with the US investment in China is so much more than what India does. So a lot of it is in the eye of the beholder and how they choose to characterize it, rather than, I don't see any fundamental shift in India's position. And that's partly because India's interests are pretty unique.
And so you're saying that these various alignments for the Indo-Pacific and even just the use of the term Indo-Pacific, which is seen as different from, in the past where one would have just said, Asian or Pacific. Are these subtle changes that indicate a movement towards the US?
I certainly we're much closer to the US than we have been before. India-US relations are probably at their best in the last 75 years since independence. In different issues, you have different groups of people working together, those who are both willing and able and have an interest actually in, whether it's a Quad, for instance, it's a natural grouping of those who are interested in freedom of navigation, maritime security across that common oceanic space from the west coast of the US to the east coast of Africa. I mean, that is one body of water. And so, I mean, it makes sense in that sense. So you have different sets of groupings, and India works with all of them as part of strategic autonomy. India works, I mean, the Prime Minister was just at Samarkand for the SCO meeting with China, Russia, and the Stans, Kazakhstan, and so on, the Central Asian republics. So India works very closely with those partners it can find on its interests. But that doesn't preclude closer relations with one partner or another. It doesn't preclude relations getting worse either, as we've seen in the India-China case in the last few years. So I think this is a very fluid situation, not just for India, but when you look at the geopolitics of Asia, as you said, today it's very, very fluid. And there is great power rivalry across the board. The flashpoints are all live, whether East China Sea, Senkaku Diaoyu, Taiwan, South China Sea, the India-China border. There's a whole, so there is a churn going on. And I like to describe this as being between orders. This is not a settled order that we're operating in.
What you're describing sounds, as you say, like something very much in flux, as if all friends and all enemies almost at the same time, or no friends and no enemies all at the same time. But the US is not framing it in that way at the moment. And in fact, many countries aren't. They talk about, these are our friends. And in that friendship also then is a whole range of things about trade, about security, about 5G, about almost anything. And then there are the not friends. This framing of friends and foes, is that particularly helpful? Wouldn't it be better just to look at the individual actions of, as you say, states for particular issues?
Well, there's two kinds of framing that are being offered to us today. One is, both of them are this zero-sum, friends, enemies, plus, minus, black, white, good, bad. One says that the world is divided between the autocracies on one side and democracies on the other. The other framing says the East is rising and the West is declining. I think these are oversimplifications. And frankly, I don't think they're helpful at all, because the world is much more complicated than that. And if you look at the reaction of the world to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and to the sanctions and the effects, apart from the West, there's very little support for those sanctions. What most people seem to want is a third way, is an alternative. They don't want to be locked into choosing between two camps or stuck between two blocks and tied to one side and have their decisions made for them by this bloc or camp or alliance or whatever you call it. When people present it as either the East is rising, West is declining, or as democracies versus autocracy, these are attempts to impose an order on a disorderly situation and on a level of chaos that, frankly, we haven't known for a long time. And if we want to get out of it, I don't think that trying to impose some mental construct which doesn't fit with reality is the best way.
How do we get out of this chaos?
Well, by addressing the main issues that face us today. I mean, you look at us as an international system, we haven't responded coherently to transnational issues since the global financial crisis of 2008. 2009, we did manage in the G20 to take steps to avert a Great Depression, to avert the collapse of the banking system. And we did do something. But you look at our reactions to climate change, to the pandemic. I mean, where is the coherent international response to any of these? To the debt crisis, which for the last 4 years we've been raising in developing countries. And there is no coherent international response to these problems.
Isn't that a romanticized view, though? That we used to be unified, when we weren't?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the balance of power has shifted. But we're still in the process of it shifting. You know, we went from a Cold War bipolar world to a world which was primarily unipolar after the collapse of the Soviet Union, end of
domination by the US, at least.
Dominated by the US. It was the US's unipolar moment. But with the global financial crisis and the shift in the economic center of gravity and the political center of gravity towards Asia, so things have got much more confused. And that balance of power keeps shifting. So therefore, you have, as I said, you're between orders. And you're not quite sure what's going to replace this and where you're going with this. So what's the best answer to that? For me, the best answer is exactly this. Deal with the big critical issues, find those who are willing to work on them, and work with them together, those who are willing, capable, and interested. But if you start drawing ideological lines or saying, you know, I won't talk to my friends, you make peace with your enemies. You don't make peace with your friends. So it seems to me logical that you need, in an open situation like this, you need a much more open mind and a much more open approach.
Ambassador, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.